to know if you are living in a tiny home already. I'd like to know what kind of tiny home that is. Is it a tiny home on wheels? Is it a park model tiny home? I'd really like to know, and I'd also like to know, what state do you live in? And do you live in a community or do you live on a piece of property? I know that's a lot, but it would really help our listeners today in making their decision if they want to go tiny. So share with us in the comment section. We'd like to see where you're living and what you're living in. So hi, my name is Cindy. I'm a member of the Tiny Home Tours team, and this is our live Q&A. Let's Talk Tiny. We meet here every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Central, and I just want to tell you that we're very thankful that you joined us. My heart is to be able to help those with my limited information that want to go tiny, to give you all the information that I can to help you make that decision whether this lifestyle is something that you really could do. So today, we're going to be talking about tiny homes on wheels. Last week, we talked about park models. Now, for those who've watched our Q&A, you know I live in a park model. And so there's a lot I could speak to about park models. I live in a park model community. I've been in lots of park models. So there's a lot about park models that I know. Now, I'm going to preface this today with I've actually never set foot in a tiny home on wheels. However, when we were looking to go tiny, I researched both tiny homes on wheels as well as park model tiny homes. And actually, before I ever even knew there was such a thing as a park model tiny home, all I did research was tiny homes on wheels. So I'm just going to come at you today and say, I don't know everything, but I'm just going to share my research with you in hopes that that might help you make a good decision if you're really looking to go tiny as to what type of home you would like to move into. So if you have any questions, I want to say, drop them in the comments, whether they're about our subject today or just about tiny homes in general. I'd love to be able to help answer your questions if I can. But stick around because we're going to be talking about tiny homes on wheels. What is a tiny home on wheels? How do they compare to park models? Pricing, where to purchase them, and more. So we're going to start by defining what is a tiny home on wheels, because I know when I first heard about them, I didn't know what they were. And to me, a tiny home on wheels would have been an RV that you purchased at an RV place. But a tiny home on wheels is a fully mobile tiny home built on a trailer. And I want you to think in terms of a tiny home on wheels versus an RV. They're just built a lot better. They're built to last, and they're built more like a home with sheetrock walls and insulation, that sort of thing. So it's a better quality home. Now, I have a question here by Smiley16, I think. Does a park model mean it's not moved? Well, a park model can be moved. However, a park model is not meant to travel around. That's the difference between a park model and a tiny home on wheels. A tiny home on wheels is meant to travel if that's what you want to do with it. So a park model is really meant, think about the words. Tiny home on wheels, it's meant to travel, but a park model is meant to be parked. Yes, it has wheels, it's on a trailer, but it's meant to actually just stay in one place. They're not built to travel around the country like a tiny home on wheels would be built to travel around the country. Now, let's talk about some of the characteristics of a tiny home on wheels. Number one, the sleeping space in a tiny home on wheels is generally going to be in a loft space. However, saying that, I have seen so many new tiny homes on wheels that have a downstairs bedroom, or they have a Murphy bed situation, depending on the size of the home. Some have, and I've actually got a link to one in the comments of this video, some have a downstairs bedroom as well as a loft bedroom, which I think is super cool for this amount of space that a tiny home on wheels has. Let's see. Gail asked, Cindy, who built your park model home and would you recommend them? Platinum Homes. And yes, I would recommend them. There's a lot of great builders out there for both park models as well as tiny homes on wheels. Platinum's a good one to look into, but there's a lot of great ones. And just do your research. But you could start looking if you're interested in a park model at Platinum. They're a great builder, and I think that they deliver homes for I don't know, all over the USA. I don't know for sure, but I know they're here in Texas. So another characteristic about a tiny home on wheels is that it is the living room space is generally going to be quite a bit smaller than a park model tiny home. Uh, a park model tiny home can be as wide as 10 feet. Some, like mine, is 15 foot wide. So you can imagine the difference between that and a tiny home on wheels, which is generally only 8.5 feet wide, 8 to 8.5 feet wide, how much smaller your living room space is going to be. And I have seen tiny homes on wheels that have 2 bedrooms, one on either side of the home, generally a loft bedroom, and that can take up your living space. So when you're considering what type of home you'd want to live in, you want to consider the size of your living room space, and is that important to you? Because a lot of people who live in a tiny home, they're more outdoorsy type people, and that living room space isn't that important to them. So that's something to consider. Let's see. Okay, so the difference between a mobile home and a manufactured home is one of the questions that I got. I would say, and this is, I'm not an expert on this, let me just preface that. I would say a mobile home is not built with the same construction as you would get in a manufactured home. A manufactured home is going to have true sheetrock walls with that type insulation. They're built better. They're built to last longer than a mobile home. That's just my opinion. So I'm not sure that I can really answer that, but I think in terms of when you're asking me that question, I think in terms of the difference between an RV and a park model home. It's the same kind of a difference to me. For a tiny home on wheels, again, we're just talking about some of the characteristics. Usually you can get one with a pretty good sized kitchen, and I've actually seen some models that have a better kitchen than I have in my park model tiny home. But the appliances are going to generally be smaller. Now, again, everything I say, I just want to say I've seen them with full size appliances. You get what you want to fit into that space if you're building your home. But generally, the kitchens are going to be a bit smaller. And then also, storage in a tiny home on wheels might be a little bit trickier than a park model tiny home. Now, even having said that, when you're working with your builder, if you're building a tiny home on wheels, you can let them know some of the things that are important to you as far as storage. They have come up with so many creative ideas. They build drawers on the stairs, which we have, but I know in the tiny homes on wheels, they do that even more so. There's storage space built within the stairs, if there are stairs as opposed to a ladder. They build a bed frame and put drawers underneath that. So there's the capacity when your builder's building your home, if you're having it built, to build in the storage that you need. You just have to work with them on that and tell them what's important to you. Um, so I want to know if you're really thinking about going tiny. And if you are, what is your motivation? Because that can help you decide whether or not you want to go into a tiny home on wheels as opposed to a park model type tiny home. What's your motivation? What is your why? Why are you wanting to go tiny? And I know for many of us, it's to be out of debt. It's to have the freedom of not having all the things. And maybe, for instance, in my situation, my husband and I are retired. I've talked about that before. So our expenses are quite a bit less than what they were when we lived in a 2,400 square foot house. So, what's your motivation if you're wanting to go tiny? And again, I'd love to know if you are watching and you live tiny currently. I'd really love to know that. So Smiley says downsizing and affordability. I will tell you, there's a lot to be said about those two things, the downsizing aspect and the affordability. And either way you go, whether you went into a tiny home on wheels or a park model type tiny home, you get all of that within those two packages. And you're kind of forced to downsize, and it's really nice to have the freedom from the stuff, all the things that we collect, throughout our life. And also, it's less maintenance, less stuff to take care of, less home to take care of. So there's a lot of wonderful things about going tiny. Thanks for sharing that. I want to talk to you about the differences, because a lot of people, don't know really what the differences are between a park model tiny home and a tiny home on wheels. So let's talk a little bit about some of those differences, and maybe that'll help you make up your mind how you want to research tiny homes. So with a park model tiny home, you get more comfort and space. Like I was talking about the living room space in a tiny home on wheels, it's generally quite a bit smaller than what we have here in a park model home. My living room space fits a full size couch, which we love. That was super important to us. So, if that type of furniture situation is important to you, you would maybe want to look at a park model tiny home. And then a tiny home on wheels is better if you want the mobility as well as the minimalism, because you're going to be forced to go a little bit more minimal living in a tiny home on wheels than you would a park model type tiny home. And then the mobility. Think in terms of I've heard of traveling teachers, traveling nurses, traveling photographers, and then even I've seen couples that they just want to go. They've retired. They want to go travel throughout the United States. If that's something that you would really love to do, a tiny home on wheels might be the best option for you. You can take your home and you can travel, stop where you want to, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but stop, stay for a while and then move on when you're ready. So that's a great thing about a tiny home on wheels. The main difference between a tiny home on wheels and a park model is that a tiny home on wheels, of course, allows you the ability to travel, but you need to make sure that you have a vehicle that can tow that tiny home on wheels. And so you need to know um, the weight capacity of your tiny home. You need to know the weight, and that includes all the things that are in it, not just the home itself, to know what type of vehicle that you're going to need. The thing with a park model tiny home, usually it's somebody tows it to where you want it to be, kind of like a mobile home. They tow it to where you want it to be, and then it's parked, so you don't have to worry about those things. And then the other major difference in a tiny home on wheels versus a park model is the size. So a park model is generally 10 to 12, and some are 15. Ours is a 15-foot wide park model tiny home, which we love. And the difference in those few feet can be huge. For instance, in a lot of the park model tiny homes here in my community, they can't fit a king size bed. Mine has a king size bed with room to spare on either side. So that size can be key if that's something that's important to you. They generally range around 399 square feet. And I've talked about this before. We have a loft that gives us 150 extra square feet that doesn't count in our square footage, which means we don't have to pay property taxes. A tiny home on wheels ranges from about 16 feet to 30 feet long and is about 8 to 8.5 feet wide, although I've seen some that are 10 feet wide. Now, the size of a tiny home on wheels is important to know, because it has to be within a certain size range, including the height, the width, and the length, to be permittable to be towed on the road. Some For some buyers, they're not really interested in towing their home. They just want a tiny home on wheels that can be moved easily. Um, so if that's not a key factor to you, you can go a bit bigger with your tiny home on wheels, but they average about 150 square feet to 320 square feet and generally includes loft space. If not as a bedroom, definitely as storage or an extra room. So, I have a question. Is there a video of your home, Cindy? Absolutely, there is. You can go on Tiny Home Tours YouTube site and as well as on Facebook. There's reels that are available, but I actually did a tour of my home. It is probably about a year old. So, you're going to want to go down the videos until you see my face with my husband, and you can watch my tour on our YouTube channel. Chris put a link to it. So there you go. You don't even have to go research it. Thanks, Chris. Okay, so let me see. Where was I? Okay, we were talking about the difference in sizes. So if size is a major factor for you, you might look into a park model. If you love the comfort and the coziness of a smaller square footage and you actually want that smaller footprint, then you might consider a tiny home on wheels. And actually, this is a good question that goes with what I just said. Doesn't it get suffocating to live in such a small area? Absolutely not. Now, again, that's going to depend on your personality. But I have to tell you, and I've said this before, my home to me is like a glove. And I actually have to make myself get out of my home because I find it to be so comfortable. There's not a day that goes by, and I mean this sincerely, that I don't thank God for my home and the fact that I'm out of debt. And I live here with my husband. Most of you know I live here with my husband. We don't have a problem living together in this space. And I know when we were considering going tiny, people would say, how can you live in such a small space with your husband? Well, you make it work, but it hasn't been a problem for us. Now, we have a routine that we do throughout the day. I take a shower at one time, he takes a shower at another time. So we just do different things at different times. If I'm working downstairs, he might be upstairs or in the bedroom. If I'm working upstairs, he'll be downstairs or in the bedroom or out on our porch. So you just make it work. But I can promise you, for me anyway, it has never felt suffocating. I feel like we have ample space. And even today, when I was preparing for this live, my thought was, I feel kind of bad to say I live in a tiny home, because when I look at a tiny home on wheels and that square footage, I almost feel like I'm cheating. I don't feel like my park model's really a tiny home. So no, I don't think you would feel suffocated, but it depends on if that's something that you really want as a lifestyle. I have another question. I need to downsize for monetary reasons and because I'm a single elderly female who lives alone. Less upkeep and maintenance. Wow. Yeah, Leslie, there's so many out there with that same desire and for the same reasons. And I want to tell you, it can be done. It can definitely be done. There's a lot of communities out there. One of the videos that I put in the comments today is a lady that is single. At least I think I put that one up. But if not, she's on our channel. You can go check it out there. But there's a lot of single women who have found tiny living to be the answer to their financial needs, as well as living within a community and finding friends who are like-minded, finding people who live close by and are willing to help. Because I've said this before about a community. When you live in a tiny home community, it's not like living in a traditional subdivision. People know their neighbors and become close to their neighbors. And that's really important. Chris put a link up for single women living tiny. So check out that video if that's something that interests you, Leslie. But I can tell you, if it's something you want to do, go for it, girl, because it's worth it. It's worth the research, and it's worth taking that step of faith and moving forward. So let's see. I want to go back to tiny homes on wheels because that's what we're talking about today. Although I love all the comments and keep them coming. Um, so where do you purchase a tiny home on wheels? Where can you purchase one, and how much do they cost? Well, first of all, let's talk about the cost because I kind of skipped over that. You can get a tiny home on wheels. Now think do it yourself, or buy a home that needs a little bit of fixing up. We call that a fixer upper here in Texas. You can get one for like $30,000 to $70,000. Now, when I say do it yourself, I know a lot of people out there go, oh, I can never do that. But we have videos of women on our website, women who are my age or older, who've actually built their own tiny home or fixed up their own tiny home. If that's something that you want to do, you can do it. And I always hear there's a YouTube out there for everything. There are YouTubes out there to help you build your own tiny house, believe it or not. And if you used reclaimed materials, you can build you a house quite inexpensively. Just throwing that out there, that's free. But generally, if you're having a builder build your tiny home, even if you're buying it used, you're going to pay from about $75,000 to $250,000, depending on the build, depending on what you want in your build, in your home. It's going to depend on the type of trailer that you want for your home. So that would depend on how you're going to tow it. Okay, so it'll depend on the trailer. It'll depend on things like solar capabilities or off-grid capabilities that can play a factor in the home cost. And then also, it'll depend on upgrades, just like with when you're building any type of home. If you want upgrades, that's going to cost you. You can have them, but it's going to cost you. So all of those are factors that can increase the cost of your home. If you're wanting just a simple home, you can do that and probably get one anywhere from 75,000. Probably I've seen them to like 125 to 50,000. It just depends on what type of home you're looking for. Think used. Buy a used home. Get you a handyman that can help you make it into your home. That's another option as far as price. I want to throw out a couple of builders that I know of, and I think if not in the videos that I've linked, definitely on our YouTube channel, you can find these builders. Tumbleweed and Clever are some really good builders to look into. So the key is your builder. If you're going to build a tiny home on wheels, make sure you research your builder. I can't say that enough. Make sure you research your builder, that it is a good builder. And I would say when you're watching our channel and you see some of the builders, look into them. Look into some of the homes that they've built and the quality. And that might be a great way to find a good builder for you. Smiley says, Smiley, thanks for tuning in today and asking so many questions. Since you live in Texas, are you concerned about the effects of bad weather? No. And I'll tell you why. Because in Texas, we have hurricanes and we have tornadoes. And I've seen tornadoes destroy neighborhoods, traditional neighborhoods, whole subdivisions. So I think if you're going to get hit by a tornado, it's not going to matter if you're in a tiny home or a traditional subdivision. Now, our park model is tied down. That gives me a sense of safety. But I think, too, I can't base where I live and the type of home I live in off of fear. I have to go by what I really feel comfortable living in and what suits my lifestyle. I hope that makes sense. And let's see. Callie asked, is your background your tiny home? Yes, it actually is. This is my tiny home. This is the place that I live and that I love. So, yes, thank you for asking. And I will say it's absolutely beautiful. I love my tiny home. Um, so, then let's talk about where you can purchase a tiny home on wheels too. So, um, like a park model tiny home, like my home, I purchased it here in my community. Now, I will say there are communities that have only tiny homes on wheels, and you can purchase your home there. But I don't know of a lot of those. Whereas with a tiny home on wheels, I'm sorry, a park model home, there's tons of communities out there for park models where they actually sell the park models. Um, so that would be something you would need to research if you're looking into a community for a tiny home on wheels. Do they actually sell them? I'd say your best bet is going to be to find you a good builder or to find you a used home. And again, like I said before, have it fixed up. Um, Tiny house listings as well as RV trader listings, and then Facebook Marketplace. Those are some good ways to search for a tiny home on wheels if you're looking for something used. However, I will say there are scammers out there, and you want to be sure that you're not being scammed. Never give money out front to someone you have not met face to face and actually seen the product. And even then, I would say research that person and make sure they're not a scammer. I would hate to see anybody get scammed. Um, Again, in the link to this video, we've included 3 links of tours that we've actually done on tiny homes on wheels. And so you might want to check out the builders on those tiny homes. Those are some awesome builders. So you might want to check that out. And then I want to know in the comments if you've watched our Let's Talk Tiny live Q&A before, what is the number one thing that you do before you buy a tiny home? If you know, put it in the comments because everybody needs to know. What's the number one thing you do before you purchase a tiny home? That's important. And while I'm waiting, I've got here, where can I find a tiny house with land? Well, that's the $1,000,000 question. Where can you find a tiny house with land? That really does lead into this next segment. What do you need to do before you purchase your tiny home? Well, whether it's a park model or a tiny home on wheels, I'll just answer that question. You have to know where you're going to park it. That's the number one thing that you need to do before you ever purchase your home. You have to know where you're going to park it. And when it comes to land, um, you don't just go buy a piece of land thinking I'm going to put my tiny house on there. You need to research that land. You need to check on zoning laws. You need to check on restrictions and make sure it's okay for you not only to have a tiny home on that piece of property, but can it be a tiny home that you can live in full time? Can it be your permanent dwelling place? So that's important to know. Um, RV parks, tiny homes on wheels, nowadays can generally go into an RV park. But again, saying that, you don't want to just depend on the fact that you're going to be able to take your tiny home on wheels, hit the road, and go park it at just any old RV park. Some take the tiny homes on wheels and some only take RVs. You're going to need to do your research on that as well. And then private land, again, you can get private land, but you need to check on zoning laws. You need to check on whether or not you can put a tiny home on wheels or a park model home for that matter on that piece of property. So there are some great tiny home on wheels specific communities out there. Let me just throw out one that I know of because I've seen it recently is Alcony Bell in North Carolina, but I know there are some in Tennessee. I think that there is one in Durango, Colorado, and I'm sure there's others all around. You just have to search for them. So that would be the number one thing, is to find out where you're going to park it before you ever have it built or ever buy it. And then do your research as far as zoning laws, if it's a piece of land or a piece of property. Okay, so let's see. D, it looks like, says, Good afternoon. I am new to this idea. Are there any tiny brick homes? Well, let me just say, Dee, that yes, there are, but they're called ADUs. They're accessory dwelling units, and generally they're a part of a main home. So they would be, think, casita or mother-in-law's house, that it's attached to a home, or they're on a foundation. Um, so yes, there are some that are brick, but not a tiny home on wheels, and nor a park model. I've never seen any with brick. Now maybe you could get a faux brick look if that's something you're interested in, but no, I've never seen any that are brick. But there are, like I was saying, there are ADUs out there, and I have seen some. I've actually stayed in one that had brick on it. Now it was a part of a main dwelling unit. It was a casita, and so there are those out there, and I've actually seen where you can lease some of those. And for everybody, a park model or a tiny home on wheels might not be the best choice for them. You might find something like an accessory dwelling unit that would be a better option for you. And again, there your concern about the weather might not be factored into that as much as it would be a tiny home on wheels or a park model type tiny home. Ned James, oh no, I lied. Look at there. I didn't really, but Chris put a link to one in the video. So thank you, Chris. He's so up on it. I'm so thankful for him. So I tell you what, we're really out of time today, and I didn't even get through everything. But I want to thank you so much for joining us. I really want to encourage you to go to Tiny Home Tours and look at our YouTube channel. There's so many great videos on there, and check them out if you want to look into tiny homes on wheels or park model type tiny homes, as well as builders and communities. Thanks for joining us. We're here every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Central Time for Let's Talk Tiny, and I hope you'll join us next week. Bye.